Welcome, everybody. It is wonderful to see so many old friends and new friends here tonight. This is our first gathering of the autumn quarter for the TELOS initiative, and we are having a wonderful symposium, Learning Across Boundaries, Connecting Children's Learning Across Homeschool and Community. And I wanted to just say a couple words about the TELOS initiative. This is a graduate school of education initiative that is really designed to think about advancing equity by creating and investigating ways that technology can increase learning opportunities for K through 12 students and their families and their teachers. This is a hot topic now, an important topic, and a very complicated one because there are no easy answers. I think many of us hope that technology would bridge all kinds of divides, and we're not really seeing that. So it's important to have spaces where we can come together and discuss and think about what next steps are and how to work creatively. What we do in this initiative is we fund innovation, mostly for Graduate School of Education faculty and students, but also their partners. We are really interested in catalyzing collaboration and conversation. So these convenings that we have are intended to start this kind of conversation and keep it going across multiple spaces and multiple stakeholders. And then we're working on supporting educators, both in-service and pre-service teachers. We have a small group of team members. Maybe everyone could raise their hand who's on the TELOS team, including our advisory board. Great, awesome. And we've hosted about 10 convenings so far. And what's interesting about these is that we are managing to draw from different silos. I'm going to call them silos because I think they are. So let's just see how we're doing tonight. How many people would consider themselves a researcher or academic? Great. How many people would consider themselves an informal educator, out-of-school educator? Wonderful. How many people are teachers or administrators? Great, we have a few. And how many people are from the nonprofit world, philanthropy? Oh, lots? Awesome. How many parents? Great. Okay, did I leave anybody out? What's nice about having how could I forget the technology industry? How many people are from industry? Thank you for coming, because we really do know that we need to engage industry a lot more than we do, and we're really trying to work on how to make those relationships happen. Those of us who are academics in education who study learning, we often think about the design of technologies. We do studies. But it's really the companies that are getting a lot of the attention from young people in terms of learning, entertainment, communication. And so we really want to reach out and work together. Tonight we have a really interesting group. Every convening that we have feels a little bit like a circus. This is not going to be a circus, but it certainly is going to be full. So we are going to hear from Dr. Lori Takeuchi, who's Senior Director and Research Scientist at the Joan Gantz Cooney Center, and June Ahn, who's an Associate Professor of Learning Sciences and Technology at New York University. And they are going to share some data that is hot off the presses. And it's nationally representative data on children's interests and where they're learning and who they're learning from. And then we are going to have a very different kind of presentation from two speakers who are actually both political scientists. And they work at the Frameworks Institute, and I'm not going to say more because I'm going to let you describe exactly what you do, but we're going to hear a little bit from them on how the public actually thinks about learning and how it's distributed or not across setting. And then we are going to have an example of what I would consider, and many of us would consider, a very visionary, synergistic regional intervention that is in the area of Pittsburgh called Remake Learning. And we're going to get some examples of how people in Pittsburgh work together to create opportunities for everybody across setting and time. I want to say special thank you to all of the people who have supported this work. We're actually launching a 2-day workshop with this event tonight. Just a quick show of hands, how many people came for the workshop? Yes, we have people come from across the country, and we're going to be working together, including from Illinois. Special call out to Mary, who for the first time took BART and from the airport, and I told her that was very impressive. So anyway, we're excited that you're here. And we also have a really nice reception for everybody afterwards, so we're going to stop at 7:15 and invite everybody out for wine and a beautiful Greek dinner right outside. I am going to give a little special call out to the Oath Foundation because they're new. And the Oath Foundation has a mission of improving the lives of women, girls, and underserved youth worldwide by providing grants to organizations that are increasing access through education, technology, fostering leadership, and cultivating creativity and innovation. And so we're excited to have them be part of the family, and I think we're going to have a representative. Hey, welcome. And people can talk with you at the reception as well about the work that you're trying to do and how we can all help. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lori Takeuchi.
So tonight, June Ahn and I are going to be sharing some of the findings from a survey we recently conducted with parents on how they're supporting their children's learning across homeschool and community settings. Okay, so first I'm going to provide an overview of the survey, and then June and I will dig into the findings. Note that there'll be a fuller report with all of the findings early next year, so you just consider this to be a preview, okay? Okay, so the overarching purpose of the Families Learning Across Boundaries project, FamLAB for short, is to create an ecosystem that can enable and encourage young children's learning across settings. Because we know from prior research that the most resilient and adaptive learning isn't confined to school. Deeper forms of learning require prolonged periods of engagement, span varied context, and are driven by the individual child's passions and curiosities. Unfortunately, many kids don't have access to the people, resources, or time afforded by non-school settings to inspire and guide their interests. And other factors, such as their parents' or their teachers' perceptions of learning, can also impede the flow of learning across time and place. So to fix the current ecosystem, we need to better understand these factors. And that is the purpose of our 3-survey research study, which involves separate inquiries with parents, teachers, and community-based organization providers, such as librarians and after-school providers. So, in the current ecosystem of children's learning, our research aims to discover where children are learning and with whom, how their interests travel across homeschool and after-school settings, the roles that families, teachers, and CBOs are playing in linking their learning, the extent to which these institutions are working together to bridge their learning, the attitudes, beliefs, and norms that facilitate or impede learning across settings, and how all of the above may vary by income, culture, parent and child age, and community setting. Okay, so of course, we're not the only ones working on the connected learning problem. In fact, FamLAB research was designed to complement the progress made by scholars like Bridget Barron and Kevin Crowley and the DML Hub's Connected Learning Alliance, and in 3 distinct ways. So first, whereas many of these scholars have primarily focused on adolescents through young adults, FamLAB studies younger children. As even the Connected Learning Alliance has noted in this graphic on their website, school engagement drops as students grow older, which means that we need to work on repairing the disconnected ecosystem that our youngest learners navigate. Second, most of the research to date has been qualitative or regional in nature. And we at FamLAB are simply taking many of the insights gleaned from this regional work to inform the design of national surveys that can provide data on what learning looks like in locales where research crews haven't yet visited. For instance, we've included questions in our surveys to measure the extent to which the parent roles that Bridget Barron uncovered in her qualitative study of Silicon Valley parents are being enacted in other demographic groups. Finally, we choose to use the verb bridge to describe the role that parents, teachers, and other adults play in supporting young children's learning across settings. Adults are like the architects or the engineers that design and build the infrastructures that can facilitate such learning. Children do the connecting, but adults do the bridging. Okay. All right, so I accidentally changed slides. Okay. So today, June and I are going to be sharing on just one of our 3 surveys, the parent survey. We worked with VeriQuest, a survey design firm that provides access to a national online survey panel, and they recruited and administered our instrument to parents of 3 to 12-year-old children. The survey comprised about 40 multiple choice questions and took 25 minutes to complete. We asked parents to focus just on one child throughout the survey and to identify 2 of that child's interests, which allows us to trace those interests in and beyond the home. VeriQuest set quotas for African American and Hispanic American parents at 200 each, upon which they derived a total target sample of 1,500. Turns out 1,550 parents of 3 to 12-year-olds completed the survey, and our weighted sample is representative of the U.S. population in terms of race, geographic region, and child age and gender. We also got good numbers in terms of family income and community setting, as it was really important to us to get adequate representation of rural populations in particular. We had surprisingly high male or father participation at 45%, and 15% of parents identified as single and raising the child alone. Okay, so now onto the findings. First, we describe how the adults in children's lives help bridge their learning. Okay, in one question, we presented Bridget Barron's parent roles along with a few others and asked respondents to say how often they do these things with a target child as they relate to that child's interests. So for instance, how often do you use the internet to help Lily find information about topics that Lily is interested in? In other words, these activities are driven by the child's interests, not the parents'. Here are the percentages of parents that do these activities on at least a weekly basis. On most items, we see that a majority of parents play these roles with their 3 to 12-year-olds. Taking their child to parks, museums, or other local institutions is the only role that less than half of parents report doing less than weekly. Now, when we view the same question by household income, we see that parents of all classes are fulfilling most of these roles about equally. At the P less than 0.05 significance level, low-income parents talk slightly less with their child about his or her outside interests than mid and high-income parents do. But high-income parents report reading books less often than mid and low. The most striking differences here, however, are the extent to which high, mid, and low-income parents differ from each other in driving their kids to and from sports practices, art lessons, and other enrichment activities. So why do some parents play these roles while others do not? For any roles that respondents indicating rarely or never doing for their child, we ask them to choose their top reason why they don't. The most common response for parents who don't use the internet with their child is to find stuff. The 42% in gray on the far left is that they don't think it's necessary. For parents that don't read books with their child, 39% in green say that their child doesn't want them to. Looking to the right, of the parents who don't drive their kids to after-school events, 40% in teal say it's not applicable, probably because their kids don't have the practices and lessons to attend, although time in blue and money in orange are also significant factors. Lack of time and money are even bigger factors for parents who say they never or rarely take their kids to museums and other local institutions. These reasons do indeed differ by child age and household income, but you'll have to wait for the release of our final report to learn more about these differences. We also asked parents who else besides themselves ever support their child's interests. This chart breaks down their responses by family and non-family members. Grandparents win, with nearly 7 in 10 respondents indicating grandparent involvement. And more than half of parents reported aunts, uncles, and cousins also supporting their child's interests. Looking across income once again, we see that grandparents in low-income households are more likely to play supportive roles than those in high-income households. These differences are even more pronounced when it comes to aunts, uncles, and cousins. Meanwhile, older siblings are more involved in higher income households. In terms of non-family members, high-income parents see teachers as supporting their kids' interests more than low and mid-income parents. But the most pronounced difference of all is in how much coaches, mentors, and after-school leaders support children in high-income households, which we should, of course, view alongside the earlier finding that high-income parents are far more likely to drive their kids to after-school activities. Okay, so what are these non-parents doing to support children's interests? Well, a lot of them are talking with children about their interests. This was the most commonly reported activity among grandparents, neighbors, clergymen, and other adults. Older siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and coaches, mentors, after-school staff are mostly doing the activities that children like doing with them. Teachers, on the other hand, are helping kids find materials that relate to their interests, and nannies and hired caretakers are reading these materials with them. Okay, so that's it for me. Now I'm going to hand it over to June On to talk about the places where children are learning.
Thank you, Lori. So we also asked in our parent panel where children are going. Where are they going with their parents? And they're going lots of places. And just to highlight a couple of findings in this slide, so outdoor spaces, retail spaces, places around the neighborhood, restaurants, cafes, friends' houses, and libraries. Those are the most common areas that parents are reporting children are going. But we also found really interesting the places where children aren't going. So, down in this chart, after-school programs, 37% of parents reported that their child visited an after-school program in the past year. And even less, 19% said their child visited an after-school program in the past week. And I think that kind of echoes a little bit back to Lori's findings around which parents are able to drive and transport and provide access, right? And so we want to, think about these results in combination. We could also look at differences in going places by urbanicity and by socioeconomic status. And so one thing is, to point out that's interesting, at the top chart, urban parents are reporting more often going to museums, for example, versus rural and suburban parents. And in the bottom chart, we see a strong relationship with socioeconomic status. So for example, parents from higher SES status groups are reporting visiting places like sports facilities a lot more than parents in lower SES status groups. And so these patterns are really interesting to think about where are the environments that we can leverage as opportunities for families. So socioeconomic status is also related to what activities young people are participating in. So for example, just really quickly, the starkest difference we saw was at the top around does your child participate in organized sports? And it was really stark to see that parents in higher SES families, 63% are reporting that their children participate in some form of organized sports, whereas lower SES parents, 33% report that their child is participating in sports. And you can see these differences across different activity types. So we also were interested in how parents were connecting to their school environments and what their perceptions were between school, home, and after-school connections. And it's quite interesting. So parents have different varying perceptions about how their children's time should be structured, and also where the location of educating students should be. And so, for example, on the left-hand side, a majority of parents agreed that it's really important to them to have unstructured time for their children. But then it's also interesting that almost 2/3 said that they try really hard to get their child involved in as many things as they can handle, right? And so we want to unpack this finding somehow. On the right-hand side, parents, about 46% of parents are saying that they really believe school is the place to educate children. But I like to think about the counter, which is that 54% of parents are reporting then that they value out-of-school experiences as a place to learn as well. And 37% of parents agree with the statement that teaching children is primarily the job of school teachers in schools. But that means the majority of parents value educators outside of school as playing a role. But while parents are really valuing out-of-school experiences, we thought it was really interesting when we asked them whether or not they felt their children's out-of-school interests were relating to their in-school learning. Lower percentages of parents reported that connection. So for example, 40% of parents said their children's out-of-school interests were helping them with art, music, culture classes in school. And even less for the STEM fields. So about 25% of parents reported that their child's outside interests were helping them with math class in school. And 20% said their child's outside interests were helping them with science class. And so this is really interesting to us. Like, it opens up a couple of questions, such as, whether or not parents view school and out of school as connected or disconnected, or if they're distinct areas or not, right? And again, we have no claims about that here, but it's so interesting to see those patterns. But there's some cause for optimism because there's a lot of great communication that's happening between schools and parents. So parents are reporting that their teachers and their schools are doing a really good job keeping them informed about what's happening in school. And so things like sending emails and weekly reports and things of that nature. And a very low percentage of parents are reporting difficulty communicating with their school. So that's a really positive finding. And so what that suggests is, could we use those communication mechanisms to improve that kind of connection between school and out of school? So we were also interested in asking parents about those interstitial moments, those everyday mundane moments that we might overlook as potential learning opportunities. So one example is just driving to and fro from places, transportation. We do that every day, every week. And so we asked some questions about where kids were going and in what ways. So in the top chart, we asked about how kids go to school. And so, for example, we saw by SES that higher SES families were reporting more often using the car or family car, and lower SES families were reporting more often using the school bus, for example. In the lower chart, we looked at it across urbanicity. So we could see that urban and suburban families were reporting using the car more, and rural families are reporting using public transportation more to go to school. We also asked things about, like, how much time do you spend in a car or in a bus? And for all the parents who reported going around the car, it was really interesting to note that, like, 43% of parents report that they spend 3 or more hours a week with their children in the car. And so that just kind of opens up really interesting design possibilities of, like, how might you leverage that time, right? But what are they doing in the car? They're talking to their parents, they're talking to their siblings. Children are listening to music, and they're using their devices. So there's kind of like a rich ecosystem of activity that's happening in that 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours, and how might we leverage that? We also asked about those families that use public transportation. So about 1/5 of our parent population reported using public transportation with their children. And of that group, they're spending a little bit less time. So about 32% are spending less than 30 minutes a week. But at the top of that chart, about 26% are spending a higher percentage. But they're also doing a rich variety of things on the bus, talking to each other, using their devices, listening to music. So how might we leverage those spaces as well? And finally, we asked about technology's role and parents' perceptions about technology. And there's some really interesting things here. So 2 things that we kind of pulled out in these Cliff's Notes is that parents are particularly optimistic about technology like the internet and its role in helping their children learn. So when we asked about, how useful they felt the internet was for helping their children become knowledgeable about topics or develop skills or explore interests, most parents were pretty optimistic about the internet's role in that process. But then it was really interesting to unpack what parents do with their children. So across different media types, children are spending a lot of time, or most children are playing video games by themselves, or they're looking for online materials on their own. And there's varying levels of participation where parents are jointly engaging with their children in some of these activities. So there's a lot of optimism for something like using the internet to search for information, but there might be opportunities to better help parents, like, search together with their children. And there's also kind of some interesting patterns of what activities children do not do, or at least what parents report that they do not do, particularly along networking with folks online. So building social networks, finding people online who could help you. That's probably a natural pattern. I don't know if I want my 5-year-old finding people online, but what are opportunities for parents and families to be doing that together and to build that literacy together and use that as learning opportunities? Those are really interesting questions. So I'd like to end with a couple of takeaways. So what Lori and I are presenting are really, we just got this data a couple weeks ago, so we're presenting kind of greatest hits of descriptive data, right, from that. And what you can gather from that, or what I gather from that, is that there's a lot of complexity and variation in things like who is supporting a child, where are they going, and what infrastructure does a child have access to, and who does what where. So all those intricate combinations of grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, in the car, in the bus, at the park, at the museum, who's doing what where is a really intricate kind of thing to explore. I would point us to use these data as a point of inspiration to kind of pinpoint the folks we want to work with and the folks we're designing for, right? And so we can kind of move away from monolithic ideas about parenting, but parenting where, in what situation, with whom, with what networks. And I think there's more work to be done in connecting kind of frameworks about school and out of school and how those relate to each other in the general public. And also opportunities for us to facilitate more co-learning with technological tools like the internet. So like I said, this is all kind of descriptive data at this point, and we're really excited to geek out on this data and explore those questions deeper. But we hope that this descriptive data can also spur questions from you all as well. And lastly, big thank you to our funders again, but particularly Sarah Vala, who was a huge, huge collaborator on this survey project, and she couldn't be here today, but I wish she could. And Peter Gold, Jordan Lozin, and Joe, is it Chotoli at VeraQuest, who really did a great job with this survey panel for us. So thank you.
Great. Well, hello, everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. I'm Drew Volmert. I'm the Director of Research at the Frameworks Institute, joined by my colleague Kevin LeVay, who I am going to, in just a couple minutes, kick it over to because he's got the really kind of juicy findings from the research that we've been doing. I'm just going to set this up for you by giving you a little bit of context about who we are at Frameworks and the kind of assumptions that are built into this research that ground the research. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Frameworks, we are a nonprofit, multidisciplinary communications research group. Took me saying that 5 times fast a few times after I started to get that out in one mouthful. But basically, we're a bunch of social scientists of different stripes. As Bridget mentioned, Kevin and I are both political scientists by training. We have colleagues who are anthropologists, sociologists, linguists, psychologists, cognitive scientists. We bring the different theory and methods from our various disciplines to bear to figure out how to communicate more effectively about a range of different social and scientific issues. So our role with this work is ultimately in figuring out how we can communicate with the public in ways that will cultivate a better understanding of learning environments, how they are connected, how they can be better connected, and to ultimately cultivate public support for the kinds of approaches and interventions and programs that a lot of people in this room are working on and are at the very heart of. So that's where we're coming from. The first step in our process, as we're trying to figure out how to communicate effectively with the public, is going out and really understanding at a deep level how the public currently thinks about an issue. And so there are some interesting ways in which what we're going to present speaks to or can potentially be put into conversation with some of the work that Lori and June just presented from the survey, although it's a little different. So we're not looking specifically at the kinds of behaviors that particular people engage in or the perceptions of parents, for instance, of their own families and what's going on there. We're really looking at a deep level about how people think about learning environments and how they work. So our work starts from the idea that people are, as Deborah Tannen has said, veterans of perception. So as we're making sense of the world, as we're processing information, as we're engaging with the world, as we're having experiences, we're doing that not as blank slate receptacles. When we receive messages, We are not blank slates, but are in fact engaging with them based on a whole set of expectations that are built up through years of experience within a culture as members of a social discourse. And so my colleagues who are anthropologists think about this in terms of cultural models. So cultural models are the deep assumptions and implicit understandings that we all have as members of a culture that we use to make sense of stimuli that come at us, of information that we are receiving. So these are basically taken for granted ways of thinking. We're not often aware of them, they are tacit, that we are using to reason about an issue. So this is really not so much about what people think as how people think. There are a few characteristics of cultural models to be aware of. One of them is that they are shared, so they are common as members of a culture. So in this case, we're looking at national cultures, so the kinds of understandings that are common to Americans. They're also multiple, so on any given issue, there are multiple different ways of understanding an issue that people have available to them. They will often, in the kinds of in-depth interviews that we do with people, toggle between different and sometimes even contradictory ways of thinking about an issue within the same response. You'll see sentence by sentence, they'll go back and forth between different ways of thinking about an issue, and Kevin will show you some of the ways in which on the same issue, people have these different ways of understanding the same thing. These are durable ways of understanding things. So unlike public opinion, which can really vary quite a bit in a short time horizon, these deeper ways of understanding the world are really durable. They're a deep part of our culture. They shift, but they shift slowly and only over the long term. These cultural models structure the way that we reason about an issue, some of them in ways that can be productive, can help them understand the issue in ways that really align with what experts know about the issue. And sometimes those models can be unproductive, can obscure certain understandings of an issue, or actually lead people to misunderstand it in important ways. And the key thing when we think down the road about our ultimate goal, which is to develop effective ways of framing bridging learning environments, these models are activated by different kinds of frames or linguistic cues. So the way that we talk about an issue activates different ways of thinking about that issue. And so with that, I'm actually going to kick things over to Kevin, and he's going to show you, talk to you about some findings that have come out of some cultural models research that we have done about this issue and that is really kind of hot off the presses.
All right, thanks Drew, and thanks everyone. I'm really excited to talk about how people think about learning environments and technology as well. And so before I do that, I think it's important to provide a little bit of context in terms of the data that we're drawing on here, and then also to kind of give a little background on why we might see some points of intersection and disconnection between what I'll be talking about and maybe what some of June and Lori were talking about in the data that they had. So basically, what we have done is we've conducted about 2-hour-long interviews in July of 2017, interviews in Chicago and Atlanta. And we are also drawing on 2-hour-long interviews from around 2010 to 2013. And so in total, we're drawing on about 40 interviews. And so the analysis here as well is qualitative. So we go through and we kind of identify those implicit deep assumptions that people are making. And so the other thing to note too is that we interviewed non-parents as well as parents. So unlike June and Lori, we're not only talking about parents' ways of thinking here, we're talking about those who also don't have children. And then the other aspect here that I want to emphasize as well is that we're really going to be focusing on the kind of challenges that people's thinking might pose to those working in this space of bridging. And so what are some of the more problematic aspects of thinking? And so as Drew mentioned, you'll see that in many cases, a lot of the models that people might hold are potentially productive in some ways and unproductive in others. And so I'm mostly going to be focusing on what are some of the more unproductive aspects to really foreground what are some of the challenges here as far as public thinking is concerned. So with that in mind, the first finding here to emerge from our analysis is really that the public focuses a great deal on people when they think about where children learn. And so it's really what we are calling a people over places model. So while you might think of physical environments as places where children learn, right? So home, school, a library, the public tends to really focus on the people who are in those places as where children are learning, and not the places themselves, which is kind of interesting. And so if they're not actually thinking about people first before places, they're then also, they might instead be evaluating those places in terms of the people only. And so, which is to say that they evaluate learning places exclusively in terms of the people who are there. And so this is interesting because the implication is that people are really not paying attention to the physical aspects of environments or the resources that they might offer other than the people who exist there. And it also means that places that they might not necessarily associate so strongly with a particular type of person, like a museum, for example, isn't something they might think of right away when they think of as a place where a child learns, or as important as another place that they might have a more strong person associated with, I should say. So sticking here with this finding about a focus on people, there are kind of two, what we would say, dominant models that people draw on when they think about the particular kinds of people children might be learning from. And so the first is a confident expert model. And so we found that really people tended to heavily focus on expertise and confidence in teaching. So does this person know about a particular topic, and do they feel confident enough to transmit that information to a child? And so in turn, this model really leads people to focus a lot on teachers. And this was especially the case when it came to more advanced topics, or topics that they perceived to kind of be more specialized or advanced, and in turn required more confidence and expertise. So namely STEM would apply here with the confident expert model. And so this is important because what it suggests is that people, when they're drawing on this idea that you need a great deal of confidence and expertise, parents kind of fade away a little bit, actually. Or they're not really seen as someone who is, quite frankly, capable to really help a child learn what they think they need to know, essentially. So that's not to say that they don't make space for parents when they think about people. So there is an alternative model here as well that was pretty dominant, and it's a caring teacher and parent model. And so here, people really heavily assume that what's important about the people who are teaching children is whether or not they really care about that child. They're really committed, and they're not really paying attention to, in contrast to the confident expert, they're not really paying attention to the expertise or the confidence or the ability of the person. But what's interesting in this case is while it makes space for parents, what it does do more problematically is really downplay the kinds of tangible resources and support that both teachers and parents might need to actually help a child learn. It's not only going to take really caring for that child's well-being and their future to help them learn. We know that they're also going to need actual forms of support to be able to do that. So the second finding that we wanted to focus on here was school and home. So school and home, perhaps unsurprisingly, really dominate public thinking, and that's perhaps reasonable to a certain extent. And so we saw this really in two kinds of models here that are related and that are relevant for this finding. And so first is this model of a homeschool dyad. And so here, the assumption is that home and schools are not just the places where children learn, but they really are the only places where children are learning. And this is typically explained in one of two ways by people, or reasoned about in one of two ways. So one is they sort of justify this in normative terms. So school and home are assumed to be the places where children should be learning more than any other place. It's just where children should learn. The other aspect of this, too, is that people have a strong perception, reasonably so, that home and school are the places where, practically speaking, children spend most of their time. Therefore, they are the only places that children really need to be learning anyway. So another related model here that is independent but in some ways follows from this homeschool dyad model is a model of informal learning environments as supplementary. And so while there is recognition of the importance of informal learning and the environments in which informal learning might take place, they're not really widely understood to be essential, at least not in the same way that people understand home and school. And so perhaps with the exception of the home as an informal learning environment, the other kinds of environments you might put in this category, museums, libraries, after-school programs, are kind of viewed as like optional add-ons to home and school. So they're nice. Children can learn there. They might be able to learn a lot and benefit from them, but they're not really central places where children should or have to be learning necessarily. And so in turn, the implication for like thinking about bridging now is that bridging all of these environments is seen as helpful, but not necessarily an essential goal. And you can also kind of see how people, even though they might see a relationship between home and school, they're not really seeing how those two things can or do connect to other places outside of those two. So the third finding that we are focusing on is understandings of bridging are pretty narrow, or they at least differ from some of the ways you all might think about bridging yourselves. And so the first model that we found among the public when we asked them about what do you think the relationship is between the learning that might happen in museum and the learning at home or learning at school, they really drew on this idea of a repeat and reinforce model. And so there's a common assumption that the relationship between home and school, since those were the environments that people most often referenced when they talked about places where children learned, that it's really about ensuring kids get an extra dose of whatever's being learned in school. And so the implication being that the content doesn't necessarily need to be different, it's just repeating the same thing that was happening in another place. Related to this is that the style of teaching can really be the same. So the main focus is really about just reinforcing. It's not necessarily about doing things differently because you're in a different environment. And so this is important because the model really limits bridging, obviously, to simply repeating and reinforcing learning, and it's really focused on mastering content more than it is really deepening a child's knowledge of a topic. And so ideally, under this model as well, bridging involves schools really directing the show. And so parents kind of can take a backseat role and just wait for schools to come to them to kind of tell them what to do, basically. Another model that people drew on when they thought about the relationship between environments was a breaking up the routine model. And so in this model of bridging, clearly as the image displays, people assume that learning is a relatively mundane experience for children, and this is especially when they're thinking about school learning. And so in turn, the value of learning in different environments is primarily that it serves as a way to break up this seemingly boring routine of school learning. And so on one hand, it encourages a positive view of informal learning environments as fun places where you can make learning a little bit more relevant to them. But at the same time, connecting those spaces is not really a primary focus. People are not necessarily thinking about what a child might or should be learning in a museum or even an after-school program or even home should actually be connected to or reflect what's going on in another space. And related to the strong association of breaking up the routine through fun is that they might also tend to focus on informal learning environments as places where children can actually disengage from learning. So in some of the survey data we saw, parents themselves expressed some concern about making sure that their kids have time away from learning. So in thinking about understandings of bridging being narrow here, and home and school being the most prominent environments people focused on, there are also two models we wanted to talk about as far as how people thought about the relationship between home and school in particular. And so we found that there are really two models here people tended to draw on when they talked about home and school. And so the first is a sort of home-school divide model. And so it's pretty straightforward in terms of what it is. And so in this model, people tend to assume that home and school learning are really about fundamentally different things. And so typically this means that home learning is primarily about values. Home is where you learn how to be a good person, function socially in the world. And school is primarily about academics. And so following from this, parents and school teachers are assumed to have different competencies and concerns and have different responsibilities as far as what they should be helping children to learn about. And so this way of thinking clearly obscures both why and how learning can be bridged across home and school, because you're working from the assumption that if they're about fundamentally different things, then what's the point, basically? Another model that we found was a homeschool handoff model. So here, home and school were seen to be as a little bit more related to one another. But in this model, school learning is figured as kind of building on home learning. And so here, the public views children's learning beginning at home, either in general or with respect to kind of the basics of a particular content area. And then school is seen as the place where then it picks it up, basically. So school takes kids to the next level in a way. And so although the model makes space for home and school learning as connected, it largely encourages a hierarchical view of these spaces where home has a certain limit in terms of what a child can learn there, and then school is really what's going to propel them up further where they need to go. So these are probably going to be the most interesting findings in light of some of the survey data, which I'm excited to talk more about with questions. And so the broader finding here that we found is that technology is kind of generally seen as harmful to real learning, or at least it can be. And so we saw 3 dominant models of technology when we asked people about the role of technology in children's learning. And so the first is a technology as artificial model. And so here we found evidence of the public really modeling technology as distinct from learning, I'm going to use air quotes, real things from real people in the real world. And so when modeled in this way, technology is often talked about and assumed as something that really isolates and disconnects children from the physical and natural environment, the people around them. And so the model really sets up technology as limited or shallow way of helping children learn, and in some cases actually counterproductive to learning, and that it's understood as a way to either, that children either avoid learning or they learn the wrong things, such as bad social norms, how to not interact with other people in the world. Another model we saw was technology as entertaining distraction. And so this model assumes the value of technology is really in keeping children occupied or entertained. And it's especially prevalent when the public would think of television or some kinds of games. So you'll see the next model is a little bit more optimistic about games. So while allowing some space for technology as a learning tool, it's not necessarily harmful or dangerous. It still often leads to an understanding that technology is mostly just a distraction at the end of the day and can be easily overconsumed by children. So when operating from this model, people would often express concerns or desires to really make sure that children are not consuming too much television or playing games too much, because it can be dangerous. So as a result, the ability of technology can be viewed as limited in facilitating learning, and certainly less preferable to learning that might happen from real-world interaction, so to speak. So more positively, there was another model of technology that I think fits a little bit better with and actually draws on the fact that June and Lori were talking about the internet specifically when they were talking about the survey data. And this is a model of technology as responsive. And so this was a little bit less recessive in that people really tended to focus on this when they had online games or apps in mind specifically. And so this is because people really were working from the assumption that, at least when it comes to those kinds of technology, that technology can be really interactive in some ways, in that when technology is actually responding to a child's actions or input, that's when it can really help a child learn. And so the model productively focuses people's attention to the ways in which technology can actually complement children's learning. So I think an interesting thing to think about the findings as far as technology is concerned as well is that when we asked people in interviews about how technology helps children learn or whether they think it does, they really didn't talk about the extent to which adults are using technology to help children learn, or technology is something that adults can use with their children. And I think that that's underscored to a pretty good extent, actually, by some of the survey data, too. And so in thinking about technology as a bridge in the idea of something that could connect learning environments, that whole idea didn't really come up for most people. They were really focusing on children using technology and how they use it, rather than technology as something that can enhance learning more broadly in a more ecosystem sense, I suppose. So I will leave it at that. I'm looking forward to the questions, and I want to thank everyone for giving us a chance to present. Thanks.
My name is Sunana Chand. I am from Pittsburgh. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about connected learning networks in practice. And so, first of all, I want to thank the Cooney Center for having me today. I want to thank the TELOS. I want to thank Stanford for having me today. It's a real honor to be here. Although I went to Vanderbilt's Graduate School of Education, so I'm in front of me territory right now, I feel. But no, it's awesome to be here. And I'm gonna.
Sorry,
are we good?
It just crashed. I have no idea why.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
okay. Well,
Really on your own.
So, no,
technology.
it's okay. Don't worry about it.
in
I'll set.
Education.
Keep
It's
going.
fine. Okay, so let me try and remember. It would have worked there, I promise. Okay, well, I'll just roll with it. Y'all don't need the slides. So I want to take you back for a minute and talk a little bit kind of about how this dichotomy of school versus home as the only learning environments might have been created, right? I want you to think back about 100 years ago in a time of super rapid change. In a few short years, there was the internal combustion engine, there was the light bulb, right? There was all kinds of new technology that was bringing people from the rural communities into the cities. And those people were doing a new kind of work. They were assembling cars. They were churning out steel in Pittsburgh, right? They were doing the same things over and over and over again. Make this thing one way, make that thing another way, over and over and over again. And that kind of model of repetition and efficiency got put into our schools. So learn biology for an hour and then stop. Learn language for an hour and then stop. Over and over and over again. And you go to a factory to assemble your cars, you go to a school to learn. And that's just kind of how it was for a really long time, and we got used to that, right? But now we're in this new time of remarkable change. We're in this time where kids, by and large, who are going to be entering the workforce soon are not going to be assembling cars. They're going to be designing the computers that drive them, right? They're going to be tasked with answering these crazy questions. Things like, how do we solve global water shortages? How do we solve global income inequality? These grand challenges that, unlike the assembly line, have no set solutions or answers, right? And they're going to be doing all of this in a time of great challenges, a time of segregated schools, a time of growing income inequality, a time that's going to be really hard for them to, here we go. Okay, here we go. I'm here. We made it. A time where, unlike on the assembly line, you can't just do one thing one way, do one thing another way, and expect everything to work out, right? You need to learn collaboration, creative problem solving. You need to learn how to work with other people. You need to be able to provide that opportunity to have creative, engaging, amazing learning experiences for every single kid, right? Every single kid is going to need those opportunities because we're going to need everybody to contribute to these grand solutions and challenges that we have in the coming years. I mean, we talked about educators in here. I was a former educator. We know that that educating children is not just about creating a future workforce. It's not just about developing widgets, right? It's about creating really caring, compassionate, and amazing, empathetic human beings. It's about creating equitable and sustainable communities. It's about creating a just and amazing world. And so we think that in Pittsburgh, addressing all these challenges, addressing this time of incredible technological and societal change, giving every single student exactly what they need, that takes a more connected approach to learning across all different types of learning environments. And so in Pittsburgh, we've been thinking about this for some time. In 2007, we started hearing this refrain from educators, I'm just not connecting with students the way that I used to, right? That's something that a lot of generations say about younger generations. But this seemed a little bit different because it was coming from all kinds of educators. In school, out of school, old educators, young educators, what is happening here? And at about this same time, there were researchers right in our backyard at places like Carnegie Mellon and University of Pittsburgh that were starting to figure out why. They were starting to see patterns in neuroscience and brain development with young kids that were drastically different from even 5 or 10 years before. Kids were interacting with their peers, they were interacting with machines much differently than they ever had. And they were also developing, redefining, broadcasting their identities with potentially global scale versus on social media. So we started to think about, 2007 was the same year, by the way, that the iPhone came out. So the same year that Remake Learning Network started, we started thinking about, in the age of the iPhone, of instant communication, of instant access to infinite information, what does learning needs to look like? What is the role of all different types of learning environments? What is the role of an educator? What does an educator look like, to the point of people, right, being the important piece of this? What is the role of each person in our community in order to educate today's kids? And so in 2007, we started bringing together groups of people in Pittsburgh, museums, nonprofit schools, funders, to think about this really grand challenge of how do we need to change the way that we educate our young learners today in our community? How do we support Pittsburgh's children from every different front door they might walk through in order to support their learning? And over time, those conversations grew, right? And we started to realize that no one organization and no one person could solve this grand challenge that we were up against. It would take schools, but it would also take museums and libraries and funders and government and higher education institutions and nonprofits and advocacy organizations. And everyone had to come together, and business and industry as well, to be able to solve these grand challenges. So in other words, what we needed was a network. We needed a way to communicate best practices and connect people with what other people were doing. We needed a way to coordinate the work that we were doing so that there was less duplication and more efficiency in the system. We needed a way to champion best practices and make sure everyone knew what was going on at the Carnegie libraries and how could that be replicated in a school. What was happening in Pittsburgh Public Schools and how could that be replicated in a museum? How do we cross-pollinate all of these ideas? So convening, also a big part of the Remake Learning Network. We needed infrastructure to bring different systems and places together so they could connect and really have those meaningful relationships. We're the town of Fred Rogers, so we care a lot about meaningful relationships and social emotional learning as well. And so basically, we created, with help from a community organization, the Sprout Fund, this infrastructure for connecting all these institutions and people together. And today, in 2017, we're 10 years into this work, and we have over 500 organizations in the Pittsburgh region that have somehow had a touch point with Remake Learning. And those organizations connect together in all kinds of different ways to create engaging, relevant, and equitable learning for kids in our region. By engaging, we mean that kids are actively developing and creating and making their knowledge rather than passively consuming it and regurgitating it. By relevant, we mean that learning is relevant to a kid's interest, community, culture, passions, but also relevant to the 21st century workforce and the fact that 65% or something of jobs that kids are going to enter don't exist yet when they're leaving school. How do we prepare kids for that? How do we make learning relevant? Sometimes that involves the engaging use of technology because we know that kids are growing up in these environments, but not always. And equitable means that how are we as a network across all of these different organizations making sure that the resources that are available across all of these organizations are going to the students that need it the most, that the students that need the most resources and support get the most resources and support. And so this is kind of what that looks like in Pittsburgh. Let's see if it works. Whoop. Maybe?
Hands-on learning is something that you want to do.
How do we make Pittsburgh the very best place in the world for children? We're all about empowerment, but empowerment through technology innovation. We work with local service organizations and local students, parents, families, and adults in such a way that our technologies can be authentically useful in them improving their circumstances.
This is the one, right?
when I go back to school, I'll be able to apply what I've learned here into my classwork. And when I do that, I'll be more prepared looking for a job after I graduate.
The learning and rehearsal of skills, whether it's arithmetic or literacy, becomes so central. What sometimes gets neglected is how do we help children grow on the inside?
It's really about pivoting the conversation from education to learning and harnessing all of the assets in a community to contribute to that overall learning journey a young person takes.
We need to learn a lot throughout our whole life. We should never stop learning.
Okay, so those are the types of organizations that are involved in Remake Learning. You saw certainly schools, but also museums, libraries, out-of-school spaces, all kinds of different places where kids are learning and experiencing these opportunities. And we have a focus in Pittsburgh right now on engaging in relevant learning for every single kid, making sure that these opportunities are not just available when you can travel to them in a car, right? Reflecting on our research from earlier, but they're really available to everyone in every environment, urban, rural, and suburban. And so we're thinking a lot about how do we make sure that, again, as a region, all of our network partners are working together to make sure there are pathways for learners of color, for girls in STEM professions and fields, for remote rural populations that don't even have access sometimes to cell phone data or a library within a reasonable amount of miles, right? How do we offer connected learning experiences to them as well? And so we're thinking a lot about how as a region we can do that. And I want to just tell you a little bit of a narrative, an imaginary student, to show how pathways are happening in the Pittsburgh region or how they could happen. So I want you to imagine a student, and we'll call her Leah for the time being. And Leah's in kindergarten at Pittsburgh Public Schools. And in that environment, she might experience something like this, where she's actually sending a one-way communication to her grandparent at home, her caregiver, saying, this is what I'm doing at school today, it's really great. That caregiver can't respond, so that when the student gets home, it facilitates this kind of connected learning experience where instead of saying, hey, what'd you do at school today? Oh, nothing? Interesting. You could say, I saw you building with those blocks. What were you building? How tall did your tower get? What happened? This is a program called Message from Me. It's now in over 100 early childhood and kindergarten classes throughout the Pittsburgh region. And it was through a Remake Learning partnership, two people who maybe never would have connected, Carnegie Mellon University and the Pittsburgh Association for the Education of Young Children, who came together to solve a problem around parent engagement. Now let's say that Leah's grandparents said, oh my goodness, Leah is sending all of these pictures of her building blocks, and we think she has a knack for building stuff. And the parent goes to the teacher and says, my goodness, what can we do to support our child, Leah, in her building and her engineering? And the teacher goes to one of over 60 professional development opportunities offered by different partners in the network around engineering, STEM, making perhaps. And maybe there she meets an out-of-school provider. We try and do a lot of cross-pollination between in-school and out-of-school educators in the network. And she learns about one of the 170 makerspaces that are in educational settings in the region. And she helps guide Leah into one of those out-of-school programs to help expand her knowledge and skills and interest and passion, importantly, in building, right? And then let's say Leah gets a little bit older. And let's say that she goes into one of the Pittsburgh Public Schools STEAM programs and she's able to get directed into that school pathway. Or maybe she goes to the Lighthouse Project at the YMCA in media making and gets another kind of making experience. Or maybe she goes to the labs at Carnegie Library. Toby is right here from the Carnegie Libraries. And she gets this experience in a different kind of making, music making and creating in different ways, right? There's also 3D printers and all kinds of different kinds of making opportunities there too. It's possible that a student's entire educational journey can be shaped or at least be touched by different organizations and people in the network to support these passions and these interest areas that can grow in different spaces connected across a region. And so I want to think a little bit before I close about this idea of assets versus pathways. And in so doing, I want to introduce some of my colleagues from Pittsburgh who are doing this incredible work on the ground every day. We have a regional CS for All collaborative, and as a As an example, I want to say, listen, and this is an interesting thing considering the kind of repetition and repeat study that came out of Frameworks. But let's say, and not let's say, all of these organizations, Assemble, which is a community-based neighborhood makerspace, the STEAM programs at Pittsburgh Public Schools. Angela, raise your hand back there. I keep talking about Pittsburgh Public Schools. My colleague Angela from Pittsburgh is back there. And the Carnegie Libraries of Pittsburgh all teach block-based coding with programs like Scratch Junior as an introductory level to coding, right? And a student might go to the Carnegie Libraries and then go to their class at Woolslayer Elementary School and then might go to Assemble, which are all actually relatively near to each other. And that student might get the exact same experience learning Scratch Junior in each one of those places. And it might be repetition and mastery, but it also might be, man, this is really boring. I've been doing this over and over again in all these places, and I'm like done with this. I mastered it. I'm good. So let's compare that to what could become a pathway, right? Let's say she starts at Assemble, the community makerspace. And let's say after that, Nina at Assemble says, hey, you should really go back to Woolslayer and Nicole at your teacher over there and tell her that you're good with this and you can go on and do something a little bit more advanced. And then let's say Nicole at STEAM at Woolslayer says, you know what? You should check out RoboMatter's online course at home because it's a really great transition from block-based to text coding. And so let's say she prints out a certificate from RoboMatter and brings it to All-Star Code, which is a summer intensive, and says, I'm ready to do some entrepreneurship work with coding and design an app. So I'd like to enroll in this program. And then let's say she moves along and then is able to enroll in an in-school advanced computer science course like AP Computer Science. How are we creating pathways that actually build upon one another? And the important part here, right, is the, if our technology works, the important part here is actually the connections between these different programs. That's the hard part, right? Setting up the programs, we all have lots of assets in programs. The connections are the hard part. So how do you do those connections? Do you have digital badges? I'm going to talk about that in a second. Are there personal connections? Are there print documents? Or is there a person whose entire job it is to make these connections clear for parents and families? Is it open portfolios? We've experimented with all of these different things, and we can talk about it. Here's another example. We have 170 makerspaces in educational settings, schools, libraries, community organizations, higher ed. So these are assets, and we can search this map for people and equipment and things. But how do we make it relevant? We have something called the Make to Manufacturing Pathway, where we've brought together K-12, higher education, and industry, and said, how do we go from introduction to the world of making for a student and really upskill that student into something that actually prepares them for an entry-level career in advanced manufacturing? And this is something where it's an analog thing. So actually all the programs involved have placed themselves along this continuum and have a poster that we're developing in their space that says, okay, we're engaging in maker learning and pedagogy. The next step here is that you need beginner maker skills, and here's where you can go for that. So that's kind of an analog step. Here are some other concrete pathway examples. I'm going to show a couple videos. I think I have time. There was a Pathways project that was funded by the Sprout Fund about a year ago, and some of the participants are here in this room. The first one I'm going to show you is one from a bunch of organizations who worked on a youth media making pathway. So Youth Leading Change, Duquesne University, Temple, raise your hand, tell me you're about to be a star, you're in this video. Gwen's Girls, which is an after-school program. Pittsburgh Public Schools, so Angela in the back representing. Propel Schools, which is a charter school system, and Sisters of STEAM, which is an after-school program. And students who are in those programs actually are able to, you'll see, build upon their media making skills and amplify their voices via a set of coordinated and stacked kind of experiences at different places. So I'm gonna hopefully play this. We'll see if it works.
Media is so prevalent in our culture today.
It's not just a television show anymore. It's not just a movie when you go to the cinema, but it's YouTube, it's Facebook, it's Twitter. And it's really critical that we tell our own stories. And students from disadvantaged communities, it's important that their stories are told. The Youth Leading Change Pathway is about youth voice. So it's teaching the students how to express their voice in the digital environment that they live in.
They are constantly confronted with images that they might not even realize how they're kind of seeping into their perceptions of themselves. To be able to understand how media is created, kind of going around the back door and looking at, what it takes to make images and create media is really important to be able to work towards developing a positive sense of self.
If you want to do beat production, you can do beat production. If you want to do like Photoshop or any type of editing program, you could do that. Whatever you want to do, technology-wise, you can do it here.
We look at real news and fake news today in politics, and we show our side of it. It helps us prepare for the real world and figure out what is going on in our lives so we're not misinformed on anything.
These are digital literacies that are essential for students to have so that their voice is heard and it's not drowned out by their lack of access to it.
Learning pathways are something that give kids kernels of knowledge, and they follow that process throughout to kind of open their eyes. They're able to truly understand kind of how that learning connects to them as a young person and connects to the broader world.
Learning pathway is when they work, it says, hey, this is for you. Whatever you want is for you. And there are people around you who are here and ready to help you get to that.
The majority of coverage of communities of color, African American communities, deal with news related to criminality. So it's time to change these old narratives for new and more empowering narratives, and giving the students the microphone, giving them the camera, giving them the smartphone and the ability to tweet and Snapchat and Instagram their stories is a big part of doing that.
Okay, so assets on the right-hand side, different people and places and programs, and on the left-hand side, how those programs connect in an ecosystem-type way to support a pathway of young person as they're learning media making, right? And so another example, really quickly before I close, is from the Carnegie Libraries of Pittsburgh. So Toby, raise your hand one more time. I've just been mentioning the Carnegie Libraries a ton today. Let's see if we can go. They also did a pathway about linking all their experiences at the libraries. There are how many libraries in the system, Toby? 19. And so students can move from library to library. There are different resources at each. But also they can link and stack their experiences at one library too. And so again, assets on the right, the library system, which is huge and rich with resources in the Pittsburgh region. And then the left-hand side, you're gonna see a brief vignette about how they've been able to link those together.
I think that teens come to the library because they know that it's a place where they're welcome and where they will get the opportunity to learn a variety of things.
The warmth from the librarians keep me coming here, and being able to get help and revision, and also being able to sit down and feel comfortable here like it's home.
There are multiple types of literacy, whether it's photography or graphic design or sewing. These are all types of literacies that are helping kids learn how to navigate in the world a bit better and to know themselves better as well.
Teen Time is a program for 6th through 12th graders. Today we are working with Chancellor Humphrey, who is the Instagram account Keep Pittsburgh Dope, and they are learning how to use DSLR cameras and social media and Instagram.
A badge-enabled pathway is an opportunity to jump between different learning experiences around the city and follow an interest. So for us, we often get people started. So today with Chance and the teens and Abby here at West End, they're getting started with photography, but they could go to Pittsburgh Filmmakers Center for the Arts after that. I see the pathway as a series of experiences. Once you find that interest, that's going to take you deeper. Going from an experiment here with photography to one of our partners around town, like Filmmakers or Steeltown, that might lead to them realizing they have an aptitude and that they really can keep doing that.
I've learned to have patience. I've learned leadership. I learned that sometimes it takes a lot to be able to start something new, and you have to want to do it and have the determination to continue to do these things.
Okay, so again, a pathway within the libraries, but also he talked about transferring students to Steeltown, which is a video production after-school program for kids, transferring them to Pittburgh Filmmakers Center for the Arts for kind of advanced skills in that area. So the connections are there, and they're built to support a student's interest, passion, growth across multiple settings across the city. And so really quickly before I end, I just want to say that we've experimented with lots of ways to connect this, digital badges being one of them. We were an LRNG city. We were a city of learning before LRNG existed. And we've had a lot of stops and starts in the area of digital badging. The technology has not been there for us in ways that are perfect, but it definitely has helped us along this way of connecting experiences. If you want to learn what we learned about digital badges since 2013, you can go to this website, and I can make it available for all of you afterwards. And you'll find resources like this. Case studies about digital badges in action, design tools, key considerations, all kinds of stuff. So the resources are there. So thank you so much. I think we have questions now, but thanks for having me. Don't be shy.
You've got the mic.
I have a question for June and for Lori. There's a pretty well
So obvious, and we only had so much time to share so many things with you that
Sorry, here it is.
that we just didn't share that data. But for sure, and that's something that we're planning to do, and not just child age, but parent age too. I don't know if you have. I mean,
Yeah. So child age was we saw very strong patterns in the types of interests and the types of activities and who plays in what role as the child gets older. So there's definite trends there that we're totally excited to share out. And also the age of the parent, as Laurie was saying, as parents are at different ages, they see themselves doing different things, like with their children as well. So there's really nice interactions there.
Did the frameworks team probe for this at all, in terms of talking about the age of the kid?
Yeah. So in the interviews, we kind of, with all the projects we do as far as the cultural models interviews are concerned, we always begin leaving things very open, and we allow people to kind of fill in, who are you thinking of when I first ask about children in the first place? And then we did narrow people's focus to that age of 3 to 12, and to kind of echo, I don't know what you had in mind in terms of what you found in terms of which parents are responsible for things and when. I can say that in the interviews, we did find some people talking about the role of parents in a very gendered way, particularly as it relates to children's age. So mothers were often referenced as being more important when children were younger. Fathers not really interested in young children or not really knowing what to do with young children, but at a certain point they play a role. So I think that if we checked, we could actually find some points of intersection there.
Say your name and state
my serial number. My name is Jim Hollis, and I direct an organization called the Calculus Roundtable. We do after-school programs in public housing and in schools and in alternative learning environments. And I'm wondering, we actually have a program in a public housing community where the children are teaching the grandparents how to use computers. And I'm wondering if you did any research on how children teach adults technology, or that connection at all.
Oh, is that for me? Whose question is that for? Is it for everybody? I'm not a researcher, but I can answer your question. We have some professional development actually, where kids in the region are developing their own apps, and they're teaching educators that are running professional development sessions. And so there are some examples of that, but that sounds like I'm going to talk to you more about that later.
I would say, so that's one constraint of our survey, is that we did it from the parent perspective. But there is like a ton of really interesting work coming around families, and particularly family dynamics. So Rika Rose Roque, who's at Colorado, Jason Yip at University of Washington, like they're doing some amazing work of exactly that situation of like kids teaching the parents and how that happens. So I would say honestly, like our survey was very like parent focused, but there's a ton of work coming out around that.
Oh, and just to add, there's a new colleague of ours, Allison Bryant, who joined AARP, and she's the super researcher, and she's done fantastic research around grandparents and grandchildren around their technology use, and it's pretty recent. So if you just go to the AARP website, I think they even have a research section. You should check it out because that stuff is so interesting. It's really great.
Hello, hi. My name is Jacinto. I'm an educator. Just tonight was great how this was all stacked. It was just wonderful. One of the two things I pointed out was like we talked about the silos, about parents seeing education in silos and the inability to cross those. And in Pittsburgh, it seems like you've actually been able to do that with the community and the companies and all these other groups. So what could be some steps when working with parents to get them to see education beyond the classroom, beyond the home, to really get them to open up and be able to see these connections, which I think everybody here is really done great work, and thank you.
Really briefly, we started an initiative 2 years ago to reach parents and families called Remake Learning Days, where we ask our network members to basically open their doors and invite parents and grandparents and caregivers specifically into their spaces to say, come experience the future of learning here. Every single one of the Carnegie libraries has, Pittsburgh Public Schools, we have schools, museums, libraries, out-of-school institutions all host this year it was over 300 events over the course of 12 days. There were 30,000 community members and attendees that came out to experience these events. And so that's one way in which we can say, there's really rigorous, again, engaging, relevant, equitable learning happening in all these spaces, not just your school. And so that's one way that we try and do it.
So I got really excited watching your all presentations because I felt like Lori and my presentation, we were highlighting like all of the latent opportunities that were there. I mean, grandparents, aunts, uncles, siblings, and all the places people are going, like it's all there. Communities are so rich. But what I learned from you guys at Frameworks is like maybe a big obstacle is our own perceptions, right? Of just like recognizing those resources in communities. So maybe one way, one conjecture I might have is like finding ways to help people recognize and see that richness, right? And maybe that's a very simple thing we could do.
Good. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So from our perspective, the communications about learning environments is really key. And so what we typically do is we'll work with different kinds of what we call frame elements. And so one of the things that could be particularly effective is thinking of how to communicate about learning environments and how they need to be connected through metaphors, right? So the bridging itself is a metaphor. And so part of the next phase of the work that we're going to be involved in is actually figuring out how do you communicate about how children learn, where they learn, how their learning in different spaces is connected in a way that gets people to overcome some of the assumptions that we pointed out. So how do you meet people where they are, but then communicate about it in some sort of way where they can visualize it to get them beyond it? And so actually we've done some previous work on STEM learning where we've used a metaphor of charging stations. So different kinds of environments as places where kids can sort of charge up their learning, which turns this idea of kids as being drained of energy and needing to go to those places to relax, flipping it on its head and having people think of those as places where kids can reboot and recharge. And we found that is one way that's kind of effective, at least, seeing those spaces as places where children can and should be learning, if not necessarily connected to one another.
Just to add to that, so we've done also work on informal STEM learning, which was not specifically about bridging, but we found a metaphor that's useful in overcoming that idea that informal learning is just supplementary, sort of this nice add-on, but not really necessary, which is the idea of fluency. So we were particularly talking about STEM fluency in this context. So the idea of how in out-of-school environments, kids can be immersed in learning in ways that enable them to master master content, and so it's drawing on the idea of sort of learning a language to help people recognize the importance of out-of-school environments. And so it provides an example of the kind of thing that I think we can develop for this project to help people see the value of bridging and understand that in a different way that ultimately makes people more receptive to a range of different kinds of programs and approaches.
Hi, I'm Mo Fong, and I'm from industry. I'm very curious and learned a ton from all your talks, how you scale and accelerate change. Because a lot of these experiments are in cities or with communities, and we know learning is personalized, right? So if you can help me understand, how do you actually scale all of this and accelerate it?
Oh my goodness. So Remake Learning started in 2007, and it was literally probably 10 organizations, 10 people really. And now we have a network of thousands of educators who are consistently working together. And it sounds inefficient in lots of ways, but I would say the constant, having the connected tissue in a community to be able to constantly stir the pot and connect people in really interesting and strategic ways, right? It's not uncommon in Pittsburgh now for ed tech companies to be embedded within museums and libraries or schools to be playtesting their work in very early stages of their work, because those relationships, there's someone who's there to make those connections real and make those relationships happen. And so I don't think it's work that is rapidly scaled by any one technology that kind of magically creates that. I think in our context, it's really about how do you build those relationships between unlikely partners by having that infrastructure that connects, communicates, shares, coordinates, and convenes, and also catalyzes. We've had a lot of small-scale grant opportunities between $1,000 and $10,000 that encourage collaboration so that we can get people to work together on small projects that then can scale up if they're effective. Message from You is one of those, actually. Started as a $5,000 project and now is in, again, hundreds of schools and early learning centers. So give people a little bit of a push, have that infrastructure to bring people together, and then continuously stir the pot and create more different kinds of innovations, and you'll get kind of that larger cultural change. Now, we're just in one region, right? We're not all across the country, and that's also helpful in a lot of ways because we can meet over coffee with people. We can get to a place within an hour sometimes, but it's still relatively close. So that helps with the relationship building for sure.
Yeah, my name is Jude Nebo, and I direct a Center for Conflict Resolution in Africa. And I thank you for the opportunity to be here. I've learned quite a bit being here. And from the presentations, I hear quite a bit about global, and I'm basically here seeking ways by which we can extend what we are doing here to include Africa, which has been excluded in so many ways across time. And unfortunately, majority of the parents there are illiterate, so it's almost wouldn't be very effective to learn in the kids, children learning at the same time with the parents. So we intend to focus more on teachers and the students, targeting the schools. And I came across TELOS, and I see community technology centers as an effective way of introducing and sensitizing these children to technology. I listened to the CEO of Facebook and Google during their recent visit to Africa, and they emphasized seriously on including Africa in this new era of education that we are entering. So I'm wondering if any of your researchers have extended these vehicles to Africa?
Any Africa connections?
Yeah. Not for us, really, unfortunately.
But it is a great opportunity, and we're actually excited that you're here, and I hope in the informal conversation we can discuss some more, because I think the opportunities in terms of global bi-directional learning is so important right now. So let's thank our speakers. Amber wants to also share that we have an inspiration wall.
Yes, so out in the, thank you. In the reception, well, two things actually. We have the inspiration, these flip charts with different prompts, so we'd love for you all to share your questions and your reactions, maybe things that didn't come up, you didn't get to ask. We'll be reflecting on that in the workshop, the Innovation Lab that we're having over the next 2 days. And I also really want to invite you all to connect with each other and talk to someone that you don't know. We're really excited to connect people across sectors here. And then a special welcome to the folks who we haven't gotten the chance to talk to yet, who just came in from all different parts of the country, Pittsburgh and New York, and places closer like Berkeley and Marin County. So come and connect with us, and we'll talk more about tomorrow, and enjoy. I don't want to stand between you and food, so I'm out.